Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of New Books Network. This is your host, Morteza Hajizadeh from Critical Theory channel. Today, I'm very honored to have a good friend of mine here again, Benjamin Barson, to talk about a recent book that he has published with Wellesley University Press. The book is called Brassroots Democracy, Maroon Ecologies and the Jazz Commons. Benjamin Barson is a historian and also a musician and a political activist. He's also an assistant professor of music at Buckner University. And Benjamin has been here with us on New Books Network before with some of his other colleagues to talk about another book that they published a couple of years ago. Ben, welcome to New Books Network again.
Morteza, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back. The podcast we did with you last time for the Cargo Rebellion
Yeah.
with Jason Chang and Alexis Dunn was a highlight of our work on that book, and I'm really excited to share this new volume with you and your listeners here.
Fascinating. Thank you. Uh, Brassroot Democracy, and I think it's a very topical book as well in terms of, whatever, all the things, all the horrible things that are going on around the world and the rise of the right-wing governments all over the world. So I guess, and the music and art and democracy, they've always been sort of interrelated. I'm really keen to know more about this. Before we start, can you just tell us very briefly, in a nutshell, what the book is about and what do you mean by the term grassroots democracy?
Well, Morteza, I think you just said it perfectly that the this book is very much in dialogue with the current political climate, the rise of white nationalism and right-wing nationalism everywhere, to be honest. We're entering a dangerous and unpredictable world as the crises of capitalism and capital accumulation and neoliberalism reach a fever pitch, and inter-imperial conflict. You know the script. It's not a unfamiliar script for human history, unfortunately. But what's so interesting to me is that a lot of the same political forces in the United States that we're pushing back against right now in terms of this resurgent white nationalism are strikingly similar to the struggles that activists faced, Black activists faced in the period immediately following emancipation in the post-Civil War United States South. There was a huge struggle during this time period to organize Black communities to not only to vote and not only to campaign for the right to vote, but for the right to assemble, for the right to congregate, for the right to constitute a new political subjectivity. And one of the things I traced in Brassroots Democracy is how important brass bands were in terms of providing a means of congregation, a technology of sounding territoriality and social space, a way of signaling to free people on other plantations that there was a meeting happening, a way of creating an upbeat, jubilant, emancipatory, forward-looking movement that sought to dismantle slavery and racial capitalism and build in its alternative a true grassroots interracial democracy. So what I started to find was that the social relations within the brass band performances, within these African American brass band performances, especially by the end of the 19th century, really embodied the kind of horizontal, decentralized decision making that we associate with participatory democracy. So here I'm making a distinction between a kind of top down vision of democracy where the consent of the governed gives rise to a single sovereign that's going to rule over 300 million people. Instead of that, we're looking at decentralized forms of decision making, rotating structures of power, community-led efforts to share decision making and share resources and basically create a new form of democratic governance together. And you find these same values and principles in jazz band performance, in terms of collective improvisation, in terms of the artist having agency in a way that goes beyond the composer of the piece. And you see these principles practiced earlier than jazz in the brass band movement itself during Reconstruction and afterwards. So that was that's the essence of grassroots democracy. And the book tries to really historically back up that claim by looking at how central these brass bands were to a variety of different protest movements and celebrations, and how connected they were to Black agency and this kind of commoning movement in the post-war South, especially in Louisiana.
Fascinating. And I'm not a musician myself, but I do listen to good music. I try to listen to good music, and I really like the point you made about jazz and democracy, because whenever I watch, some jazz bands, they just improvise, and it's fascinating to see how, although it's unplanned, how other musicians also go along, and you have that kind of a metaphor of participatory democracy, as you mentioned. And before talking about, and I'm sure we'll talk about contemporary events and music and arts and activism as well, but I do like to get some background in terms of its history. You mentioned that it starts in New Orleans, and Louisiana, and there's Daniel Desdunes, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, that you talk about. Can you talk about its origins in New Orleans, original grassroots democracy, and who was Daniel Desdunes, and how did he use his music to draw attention to Louisiana's segregationist laws?
Yes, so this is a fascinating historical figure who's also a musician. His name was Daniel Desdunes. He was a early jazz cornet player, violin player, band leader, marching band leader, salon. He had so many different types of ensembles. Outdoor bands, indoor bands. He was considered one of the first musicians in this sort of outdoor brass band tradition to start employing what we might refer to as a more swinging relationship to time. So, in, for instance, the marches of John Philip Sousa and the kind of symphonic Western European or Anglo-Saxon band tradition, there's a straight eighth note pulse. Da 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 do da 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 da, one and two and three, and every single note is of equal length. And if you think about it, the way I'm speaking to you right now, right, I'm not speaking in a monotone. I'm not speaking with all the same rhythmic values of each word. If I were to do so, it's very hard to follow. There's an intrinsic plurality of sound in terms of human language and communication that helps a meaning be expressed with different emphases on syllables, with different intonation changes. The pitch of my voice is changing. It's a very intuitive process that has to do with just how human communication works, and how we make meaning out of sound and symbols. So what's interesting about jazz
Mm.
is there's a lot more rhythmic flexibility within a eighth note pattern. Instead of da 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 da, instead of that, it might be that same song. If you were to quote unquote swing it, it might be bum boom ba do da boom ba da da ba 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 do ba ba da da
Mhm.
da da do 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 da 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 da, 1 2 3 4 5 6 da 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 do da da da. I'm not going to give a sort of whole music lesson here, but interestingly, a podcast does lend itself to this form where we can actually get into the
Yeah.
sound of it. And so Daniel Desdunes was one of the first folks to apply this kind of what we might think about as a sort of African American rhythmic reinterpretation of the 4/4 time signature or 2/4 time signature that was prevalent in the marching band tradition and in Western music more generally. And he overlaid it with this more Pan-African or African American kind of like this sort of 6/8 or 3/4 or triplet feel against it. And anyway, that's just a fancy kind of musicological way of saying that he was one of the first people to swing in the brass band tradition. Now, what's interesting about this individual, he's not very much talked about in the early jazz historiography. There's two fascinating things that I want to bring to our attention. And by the way, the claim that he was one of the first people to swing comes from an interview with several musicians of this time period, including someone named George Field, who was a trombonist, and sort of oral history that was recorded by different jazz researchers. And what's interesting is that he credits Daniel Day-Dune with one of the first musicians to swing. He was also a freedom rider. He sat on segregated train cars. He was a person of color. He was descended from someone who was free, who was a free person. He was descended from a family that were of African descent, but they were free during the antebellum period. His family was actually descended from Saint-Domingue or Haitian immigrants who moved to New Orleans during the Haitian Revolution and Napoleon's violent, genocidal counter-revolution, where Napoleon tried to subdue the Haitian Revolution and its emancipatory movements and reinstate slavery in Saint-Domingue. He ultimately failed, but so much destruction was caused by by his campaign, that many people fled Saint-Domingue. There's also a lot of enslavers, white enslavers who fled Saint-Domingue as well. The Day-Dune family was one of these families who fled. There was different people in the Day-Dune family. Some of them were traced back to plantation owners in Saint-Domingue, but his father was actually a civil rights activist during Reconstruction who fought very aggressively and very principally, with a lot of principles for land reform, for civil rights, for Black equality, even though they were considered Creoles of color, that is, people of mixed race ancestry. So Daniel Day-Dune, one of the first musicians to swing in this brass band tradition, also a civil rights activist who won his court case against the state of Louisiana. He was arrested. It went to trial, and the state Supreme Court ruled against the state of Louisiana because the train car that he was sitting on was traveling between state lines, so it violated the interstate commerce clause of the United States Constitution, where states are not allowed to interfere with interstate commerce. However, it did not rule on the question of de jure segregation if separate and equal institutions was constitutional. Ultimately, Homer Plessy in 1896, Daniel Day-Dune's case was in 1892. Homer Plessy, Daniel's friend, and in the same political action committee, also participated in a direct action sit-in, sat in a segregated train car, was arrested, and he lost his case. So 4 years after Daniel Day-Dune's case was successful, Homer Plessy's was not. But it's interesting that they chose Daniel Day-Dune because the reason they chose him as a group, and why Daniel volunteered to do this, of course, he was a principled activist who did not believe in racial segregation and believed in Black and Afro-Creole equality, but also because he was a popular musician. It showed how much music was a form of political organizing of that time. And Daniel actually relocates because of how bad segregation got to Omaha, Nebraska with his family, where he became a really important symbol of Black arts and jazz and the struggle for racial equality there. So is a really interesting figure, and the fact that he has Haitian descent and that his father connected their family's legacy to Haiti and the Haitian Revolution just shows you how deep this connection was between the music and the imagination of freedom and the fight for social justice more broadly. So I do think the music is revolutionary in that sense, and it's not just revolutionary at the level of aesthetics, it's also revolutionary at the level of challenging this white supremacist patriarchal state. And that's kind of what the book is about, actually.
Absolutely. And there's another person, Mamie Day-Dune, and you talk about her innovations in terms of mixing Haitian rhythmic traditions with story conventions in the blues, and also how the music helped bring about all those political, cultural changes. Can you talk about her as well?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's so interesting about the blues, just Morteza, when you think of the blues, what comes to mind, if you're thinking about like Robert Johnson, or like, what's the sort of image that we tend to have in our head of blues musicians from this time period? I'm talking like early 20th century. Do they tend to be like men or women in our kind of
I
public
I
imagination?
I tend to think of them mostly as men.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the narrative that we've been
Mm.
told. And there certainly were a lot of amazing male early blues musicians, especially in what's called the country blues or
Yeah. Yeah.
rural blues. But there's also a really important line of women blues musicians who were incredibly innovative and set the tone for the music during its early inception. And here I'm referring to musicians like Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and one of those who
Yeah.
predates these women by 20 years or so is Daniel's sister, her half sister, Mamie Daydun.
Mm.
And a lot of these women were descended from the activists during the time period of uprising and revolt that we saw in Reconstruction, where, as I mentioned, there were these large scale parades with black brass bands at the helm, new forms of political organizing, occupying plantations and building agricultural communes. Those movements are largely destroyed and dismantled by organized violence that comes to characterize the South of a racialized nature. This is the period that leads to Jim Crow and lynch law. In that time period, tens of thousands, 40,000 by some estimate, of African Americans flee the plantation districts and move to New Orleans as a sort of first wave of what later would be called the Great Migration, and which is a south to north move. But first, it was a rural to urban movement of masses and masses of once enslaved African Americans and their descendants. And Mamie Daydun's mother was one of those people, and her name was Clementine Walker. She had an affair with Daniel's father, or rather, Daniel's father had an affair with her, and he had a second family essentially, which was not uncommon for the sort of Creole, French Creole culture. There was often multiple family units happening with different levels of formality and legibility to it. Mamie Daydun played the piano. She learned piano, so it seems that she had some type of musical education in her upbringing. But like many other women coming of age, many other Black women and women of color coming of age in this time period, the political and economic realities were rapidly closing around what was to become the Black working class. And the only occupation open to many of these migrant women was working in New Orleans's red light district. It's prostitution market. This was called Storyville, and this was named after a state politician whose last name was Story, who basically proposed the idea for this district. I believe it was 17 square blocks, and it was an incredibly economically lucrative environment for white investors and bankers, and an incredibly exploitative and oppressive environment for the staff, so to speak. Which included sex workers, also included waiters, bartenders, service industry workers in general, and also included musicians. And the music of this era of this neighborhood, of this red light district, of this kind of gentrifying economic tourist space, because basically this was one of the main tourist destinations for white northerner and European tourists to come and participate basically in sex tourism. They also wanted to have African American musicians playing there. This is where some of the first stirrings of early jazz and blues were felt. And Mamie Daydun was a musician and singer who also worked in the sex industry. It's kind of unclear exactly what her role was in it, but she worked in Storyville. Some people called her a madam. Others said that she herself was a sex worker. And she basically wrote one of the most important blues of this time period. And sometime in the 1890s, she wrote a piece that's been called 219 Blues or Mammy's Blues. Some musicologists have called this the first 12-bar blues form because of the recordings they heard of Jelly Roll Morton, her students, who's better known than her, playing this song later. She died of tuberculosis when she was in her 30s. And the song is a really interesting commentary on women's bodies. There's a stanza about having an orgasm with a man, a woman having an orgasm with a man outside of marriage. She says, "I love what my kid man can do. He can't do what my husband can do. I like the way he cooks my cabbage for me," which is a euphemism for having sex or having an orgasm. It looks like he set my natural soul free. And the other interesting thing about this song is that it was called 219 Blues. There's a train of that time period, according to Charles Edward Smith, that the 219 train was a train that took women, sex workers on the Texas and Pacific Railroad to the brothels on the Texas side of the circuit. And so there's a sort of stanza that was discussing the sex trafficking ring that was happening in the area in the South at that time. Again, this is all connected to the destroyed promises of Reconstruction, the rise of a virulent form of white supremacy that we're still dealing with today, and the creation of a Black underclass. And so one group in that Black underclass was this group of folks who were, basically positioned to work in the sex industry, and many of them lacked any kind of workplace protections or access to legal recourse if employers were abusive or they encountered injuries on the job, and there was some level of trafficking of an involuntary nature, most likely. And so this song was kind of like acknowledging the social reality, was mourning these people who had been disappeared. It said 219 took my baby away, 219 took my baby away, 217, the return train, going to bring her back someday. And so it's a really interesting early blues that really challenges our concept of the blues as a sort of male-dominated form. It's talking about women having sexual agency, of having sexual partners outside of marriage, of enjoying their bodies in this sort of dystopian economy, but it's also calling out, in a way, the this entire sex trafficking circuit. And some scholars like Elijah Wald, musicologists, have tried to think about this song even more. I look at the use of Haitian rhythms in the song, because when Jelly Roll Morton plays the song, he's playing rhythms like the habanera and the tresillo, which are basically Afro-Caribbean rhythms that would become really important in early jazz, and they have something to do with this exchange between Haiti and New Orleans. And the fact that Mamie Deydun is of Haitian descent is itself quite interesting. And in fact, this idea of using songs to speak back to power and talk about the oppression of women is a tradition that extends back to slavery, and specifically extends back to enslaved people in the Caribbean and in Saint Domingue. That there was a whole, like, scholars like Deborah Jensen have really pointed this out, that there's a whole genre of songs that were transcribed and poems that were transcribed of Black women talking about things that they weren't supposed to be talking about out loud. White enslavers and their so-called masters, having sexual intercourse with them, having affairs with them, and bringing these issues out into the public. So again, thinking about the blues has a very deep, complicated history that's tied very intimately to histories of both oppression and resistance, and in this case also includes a critique of patriarchy and sexual oppression that women were experiencing.
And there's another group that you discuss, the Teos, and you talk about their flights from New Orleans to Mexico, and also the establishment of a Black colony there. And I found it fascinating. Can you talk about who they were and give us a little bit of background about their story?
Yeah, the Teos are an incredibly interesting clarinet lineage in New Orleans. So the clarinet is one of the instruments that the jazz tradition transformed, turned into a improvisatory instrument within its framework, and unlocked all of these interesting sounds and textures, scoops, growls, pitch bends, different kind of tonguing techniques, all these different interesting innovations that jazz musicians employed on the clarinet. Two really important, one really important clarinetist who was part of the early jazz revolution was Lorenzo Tio Jr. He actually moved to Harlem at the end of his life. He ran he ran the band at a jazz club called The Nest. While he was there, better known jazz musicians like Roy Eldridge, a trumpet player, very famous swing era trumpet player, and Sidney Bechet, another clarinetist from New Orleans, performed with him. His parents were born in Mexico, and they were born in Mexico because they were part of a group of some 70 families of color who fled the South during the period of slavery. And they fled the South in the late 1850s at the invitation of the Mexican government under the leadership of Benito Juarez, Mexico's first indigenous president. And they fled to Mexico and they built an agricultural colony there that survived for a couple of years and then was burned down during the French invasion of Mexico. Well, technically the Archduke of Habsburg, Maximilian, he is ultimately killed, defeated. His armies are defeated, and he is killed by Benito Juarez's armies. It's seen as a giant repudiation of imperialism in the Americas. It was a very heroic, historic moment for the movements for Mexican independence. But unfortunately, one of the casualties of that war was this kind of utopian commune that the Tios were a part of. So Lorenzo Jr.'s parents and his uncle, his father and his uncle are born in Veracruz, Mexico. That's where the Tampico colony was, and these folks were given Mexican citizenship at a time when people of color and Black people could not claim citizenship in the United States. The Dred Scott decision made sure of that. A Supreme Court case in the 1850s. They actually live in Mexico for several decades, and they move back to New Orleans because the grandparents, Lorenzo Jr.'s grandparents, had moved to Mexico. The whole family moves back in 1877, just in time, ironically, for the United States to withdraw Union troops from the South and ensure that the South would reinstate white supremacy and racial segregation. But they move back and they become very influential clarinetists, and they really transform the history of that instrument in the city, because before they moved back, the clarinet was not such a central instrument in the brass band tradition in New Orleans. And they are two of the folks, Lorenzo Sr. and Louis, who ensure that the clarinet becomes a really important part of Black brass band culture. They go on tour. They perform pieces about the Cuban independence movement. They also integrate some elements of Mexican music into their music, like when they're playing those songs that are dedicated to the Cuban independence movement. The song called La Trocha, sorry. It's over a habanera rhythm, which is another one that Mammy Deydun used. And they're just a fascinating story about this kind of underground railroad to the South, where people of color and people of African descent fled to Mexico or built alliances in Mexico to withstand the assault on human dignity and freedom that is slavery. And I don't know. I just think that the clarinet might not be an important instrument in early jazz if it wasn't for not just this family, but Mexican wind band culture in general, because there's also a Mexican marching band that comes to New Orleans in 1884 and 1885. And many of those musicians end up staying in New Orleans and actually educating, being music instructors to African-American musicians. So thanks for asking me about the Tios. I'm really excited about them. And there's a chapter on them in this book.
Yeah, it is indeed a fascinating story with the Tios. And I'm interested to know more about the significance of the music in terms of what you call in the book internationalism of Brassroots democracy.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Internationalism, and specifically Black internationalism, is something that has been discussed for many years by prominent scholars in the fields of history, African American studies. for instance, groups like the Black Panther Party, even though they are ostensibly called Black nationalists, they were really more internationalist because they were building a political framework in dialogue with movements and revolutionary movements across the world, in China, in Vietnam, in continental Africa. And it's precisely for this reason that they were actually such a threat to the United States ruling class. And of course, there's a lot of literature about that. There's less literature about this specific time period in Black social and political history, and specifically in cultural history in 1890s Louisiana, basically, which coincides with the beginnings of jazz. It's largely presented in a kind of nation-centric way with an emphasis on African Americans. And yet, going into these interviews and these archives, these interviews at the Hogan Jazz Archive that are in Tulane University, that are basically at this point stored on a website that anyone can access called Music Rising. You just find example after example of musicians and sailors from Jamaica interacting with African Americans. There's a song called West Indian Blues, which was circulating in this time, that had an association with Marcus Garvey. This was a song that was performed in early jazz circles. You have songs that reference Haiti, like the Haitian Blues by the singer Lizzie Miles. You have folks like the T.O.s, who actually, one of the T.O. patriarchs, his name is Lorenzo Sr. He, after moving to New Orleans in 1877, he got so fed up with Jim Crow and the racial oppression he faced that he actually tried to move back to Mexico. He was granted Mexican citizenship. The Mexican government, apparently his contacts there, remembered him fondly, and he dies on the way, unfortunately. But that's why his son is raised in New Orleans. Just to say, New Orleans being a port city and oppressed people in this context, in the U.S. South in general, peoples of African descent looking internationally for political solutions once the United States had closed its doors to real meaningful citizenship and economic autonomy for African Americans. It makes sense that there would be a latent internationalism in the music. The other interesting example is that of the Dock Workers Union, which was intrinsically international because the Black Dock Workers Union, known as the Longshoremen's Protective Benevolent Union, it was a benevolent society which provided health care for sick and elderly members, provided funeral services. It provided a space for fish fries and Saturday night dances and Sunday night church services. It was a union, but it was much more than a union in a traditional sense. It was also the biggest Black union in the South, and they communicated with folks in Veracruz, in other port cities, and throughout Central America to talk about ways that they could combine their labor solidarity and make it significant and meaningful. And they led very successful strikes that were some of the only instances of Black political power in the South during the Jim Crow period, in a kind of like on a large scale, publicly demonstrative way. Wouldn't you know it, that these same unions, featured brass bands very prominently at protests, at Labor Day parades, and in each of these moments, these brass bands were connected to this international militancy that was challenging the ability of racial capitalism to reconstitute itself, which was a huge priority for Southern industrialists and the old aristocracy, the old planter class. They wanted to make Black folks subservient again. If they couldn't get them to work back as enslaved laborers on plantations, they wanted to make sure they could pay them as little as possible for as much work as possible. So internationalism was a key resource in building a kind of political consciousness that was outside of the gloomy conditions of the South at that moment. And it continues to be, as I said, mentioned the Panthers and movements that really come up to the present moment. It continues to be an operating principle of radical politics. So I'm glad you brought up the international question.
It's quite interesting. You mentioned that how unions, for example, use music as we see. We'll get to talk about it a little bit more towards the end of the conversation, maybe. Even nowadays, with all the protests going on around the world, music is an integral part of all those grassroots movements. And I think I read somewhere uh, that even in Italy, it was the plantation workers. They were not slaves, of course, women mainly were rice because they would use sort of like protest songs, things that might be similar to lullabies, but anyway, protest songs to talk about their low wages, hard working conditions, and the famous Italian partisan song Bella Ciao, I guess, was born out of those rice plantations. And another thing that came to my mind when we were talking about Black internationalism, a few months ago, I talked with another American academic, Bill Mullen. I guess you know him.
Oh
He,
yeah, Bill
yeah,
Mullen.
he had a book about anti-fascist blacks, and a part of the
Hmm.
book was about how influential that movement was also around the world. And speaking of music, I'm originally from Iran. In southern parts of Iran, there's a large community of Afro-Iranians, and a lot of Iranians don't know
Hmm.
these communities are actually African. They're black. They facial features are completely different from, let's say, average Iranians, and they were brought to Iran as slaves about 110 years ago, but they were quickly then slavery was abolished. They were integrated into the society, and a lot of people don't even know that slavery existed in Iran. But anyway, southern parts of Iran has a very, very lively and vibrant musical culture, and interestingly, they love jazz, they love blues. So nowadays, and lots of them are not mainstream groups, but when you listen to their music, you can easily see the influence of blues and jazz in their music, guitar, saxophone,
Wow.
and uh,
Wow.
and they are black. They are the descendants of the slaves who were brought to Iran, some from Africa, some from Ethiopia, not the African countries where slaves were taken, where slaves were brought to America, the
Hmm.
middle, those countries that are closer to the Middle East or part of the Middle East, but still jazz. Yeah, and most of them also, some of these songs are about hardworking conditions because most of them were fishermen. And it's quite fascinating talking about that internationalism of Brassroots Democracy and jazz. So I just wanted to say, look, there is this huge jazz culture in southern parts of Iran by the black community. And I was seeing an article about it, which was published in The Guardian some time ago.
Yeah, this question about Indian Ocean slavery and Iran, there's actually a really interesting scholar named Parisa Vaziri who just
Yep,
came out
yep,
with a
I know
book.
her. Yeah.
Oh, you do? Okay, that's
I haven't
funny.
read the book, but I know her. And I think, yes, I'm actually interviewing next month. She had a book
Okay.
about Iranian
Racial black,
cinema. That's
yeah.
right.
The,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
book is titled Racial Blackness and Indian Ocean Slavery, Iran's Cinematic Archive.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, I actually did a postdoctoral fellowship at Cornell University and got the
Mm,
chance to meet her and share my work with her. And
hmm
she's brilliant, and I'm so glad that you know of her work and you're going to get a chance to talk to
hmm
her. I think that book seems really interesting. Um, and she also brought attention to the music of this community of
Absolutely.
Afro-Iranians.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think, I think music in general, as you mentioned, is a sort of archive of resistance of oppressed people who have been denied access to the
Absolutely.
official historiography of these,
hmm
unequal societies. And, I mean, Bella Ciao is a great example. I mean, there's just so many, the international, international, in this time period that I was studying, it was actually this kind of like African or Afro-Creole reinterpretation of the French national anthem that became kind of associated with the Haitian
mm
Revolution, almost turned into a folk anthem. In the present day, there are groups that use brass bands to protest police brutality and build community, especially in Minneapolis, where George Floyd,
hmm
the African American individual killed by the police, where George Floyd was executed by the police. Essentially, there's a group that formed there called Brass Solidarity, and they do popular education programs and public performances as part of what they call a larger funeral function by offering a sonic piece. I got to talk to Anthony Awful, a clarinetist in that group, and he said their group was inspired by the Black Panthers' popular education programs. So there is a brass band movement still in the United States that's very activist oriented. There's large gatherings in Boston and Pittsburgh and other cities each year, like called Honk or Petonkatonk. They're like coalitions of different brass bands and social justice oriented or revolutionary organizations that sort of see the takeover of public space and the participatory culture promised by brass bands as part of a larger movement to a more just and equal and less hierarchical and genocidal and
Mm.
ecocidal world. And so I think in many ways, when I was thinking about Brassroots Democracy, even though it's talking about events and musical and social histories in the 19th century and some of the early 20th century, it's very much thinking more broadly too about, what is it about music that is such a powerful force for liberation and as a kind of expression of a new world that's being liberated by sound, that there's a kind of taking over of public space, a sort of challenging of the state's monopoly to order space and to order race and to order gender and to order all of these things. Instead, you have like giant occupations, right, of public spaces. And, in those spaces are where new types of politics and new kinds of imaginations can be born. So I think, the farther back we go into history, the more and more we're going to see just how central music has been to each of these movements. And of course, there are people that, do write on this and discuss this in detail. I think what this book does that might be is a little bit new is really looking at this generation of jazz musicians that are so revered and exalted for their role in helping create this amazing kind of like modernist artistic form that emphasizes improvisation and innovation and has really transformed the world, and showing how much that's linked to these things like internationalism, these things like political movements for equality for the commons, for building a sort of post, not only like a post slavery society, but even a post capitalist one. And you see that trend continuing into the present because there are so many musicians who are still trying to build a better world than the one we have, which is just, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like it's on a very optimistic path right now, to be honest.
Sorry, I was speaking. I think the whole time I was on silent and I was on mute. You didn't hear me, right?
No, I didn't. I figured it might be something I just didn't talk because I
No,
thought maybe
no.
there was a
Yeah,
technical issue. Nope,
so
no problem.
I'll go again. I'll edit this part out. So as you were speaking, I'm constantly just Googling and saving some songs that I need to watch after need to listen to on YouTube after the interview, and I
Mm.
was also constantly reminded of James Baldwin. He also had
Oh
this
yeah,
passion for jazz, blues, and I think he had a series of short stories, Sunny Blues. And
right.
yeah, and there have been a couple of new books, I guess, on Baldwin and music have recently been published. But again, I just wanted to mention him again as well because I know you also love his works.
Yeah, there's a great quote from James Baldwin, written in 1797. Baldwin wrote, "This is exactly how the music of jazz began, and out of the same necessity, not only to redeem a history unwritten and despised, but to checkmate the European notion of the world. For until this hour, when we speak of history, we are speaking only of how Europe saw and sees the world." I think jazz really destabilized that kind of Eurocentric white supremacist gaze earlier than in many cases uh, writers and were doing in the Black freedom tradition. I think a lot of folks like James Baldwin explicitly drew their inspiration from music, and Mary Baraka is another example of folks in that
Mm,
vein. Sonia Sanchez. So yeah, I think you're onto something there, and I thank you for bringing in Baldwin. Is, that was the topic of Bill Mullen's recent work, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the influence of going back to the book, brass bands. You did touch upon that, but I would appreciate if you could expand on that, their role in in Black Civil War and also the Reconstruction culture. And I'm really, really interested in how they, and that part of the book that you talk about how they took over the public sphere, which is all democracy is about, people being involved and taking over, let's say, sites of resistance that the system or the capitalist system will try to dominate.
Yeah, no, great question. This idea of public sphere, right, or maybe even a counter public sphere, depending on who you ask, is it's uh, it's a big site of obviously the whole liberal democratic theory and practice, but of course, Black folks were excluded from the public sphere for a large portion of the United States history, perhaps even half of it, and brass bands were a way for freed people to dramatically mark their entrance into this space. And they did so across the South in cities like Charleston and cities like Mobile, Alabama. Emancipation was a very musical moment. And it was musical because brass bands were often the first sounds that freed people would hear as the Union Army was successfully approaching a plantation that they might be enslaved on, or a city that where they were enslaved. And following this moment, it was really just dramatic to read these accounts from formerly enslaved people who talked about hearing these musical moments of emancipation. Um, Let me see if I can find one quote here. Yes, Timothy Thomas Fortune, who was W.E.B. Du Bois's mentor and author of, I think, the first Black Marxist interpretation of Reconstruction, was 8 years old when he was enslaved and then freed in the village of Marianna, Florida. And he writes that the soldiers had dress parade twice a day, and all the urchins of the village were on hand to watch it. They thought it was the grandest thing ever. They were transported by all the drum beating and bugle blowing. The bugle call for afternoon drill and parade was heard for miles around and was the first and sweetest music the freed people had ever heard. Have they heard any sweeter since? I doubt it. So this music was, so impactful on this radical Black intellectual, Timothy Thomas Fortune, that he called it the sweetest music that he had ever heard. And he was 8 years old. Um, this was the reason, I think, that brass became symbolized with freedom and liberation in later periods. And Black soldiers were also, many of them became brass band musicians in these outfits, and they continued to parade with brass bands and fifes and drums well into Reconstruction and even after. And there are even instances when white supremacists would attack Black musicians simply for playing music because they knew it was a threat to their ability to reorder racial space. They could sense that there was something powerful about this music. One former enslaver, Emily LeConte, described becoming physically sick to her stomach when she heard these bands playing. So it was also a site of pride and self-realization for formerly enslaved people to play in these large parades. And yeah, I think it just, I just love this image, of freedom being a musical event, if that makes sense. It seems to speak so much to how powerful music is, not just as a form of entertainment, but as actual a site of political and social struggle and transformation.
And another thing that you did touch upon a few minutes ago, which is about unions. Can you talk about the role of musicians, New Orleans Black musicians in unions and organizing, and how they use the music to create these new forms of political organizing?
Yes, absolutely. The union movement, since it was so connected to these earlier movements of Reconstruction, of the Civil War militancy, of this kind of underground internationalism that took place even during the antebellum period, as we saw. Black people and Creoles of color in Louisiana had connections to Haiti and Mexico and activists there. The union movement, the Black Union movement, was an outgrowth of all of those things. It couldn't not be, right? It was coming out of the same folkways and traditions of resistance. And so it was logical then that they used unions. They used brass bands as one tool to cement their association with previous moments of Black struggle, and also, built support for their struggle for workplace equality and higher wages and better working conditions, and just general power over the process of production at the workplace. They did this through, aligning themselves with this cultural revolution. And in turn, musicians found protection with the union. Musicians like Willie Parker participated in strikes. He was a clarinetist. He participated in the general strike of 1907. He described being, deeply involved in this moment, and how there was even someone who tried to. There were scab laborers at the shipping firms. He was a longshoreman. Sorry, I should have clarified. He was a dock worker. He loaded tobacco onto ships and wagons. And this was like a critical logistics hub, right, in New Orleans. And so Black workers going on strike could shut down the entire Southern economy in some ways because of the knockoff effects into other areas. And Willie Parker was a clarinetist who was part of this union movement. Buddy Bolden was a trumpet player who played a lot of events at Longshoremen's Hall, which was the hall owned by the union, run by the union. He also had a brother-in-law, Alex Reed, married to his sister Cora, who was in the union movement. He also played at many Labor Day parades. Who is Buddy Bolden? Buddy Bolden is the mythological father of jazz, one of the first musicians that's widely known. Was active in the early 20th and late 19th century, trumpet player, cornet player, incredible improviser. We don't have any recordings of Buddy Bolden, but he is widely regarded and discussed in the annals of oral history. And he was nothing. I mean, he might not have been in the union himself, but he thrived in it within a whole infrastructure that the union supported. There's other musicians who worked on the docks. George Lewis, a clarinetist. Jelly Roll Morton worked as a roustabout, a kind of like a manual laborer. And these were very hard working conditions. Jelly Roll Morton in particular described them as not better than slavery. George Lewis really damaged his arm and hand once in an accident, almost ended his career as a musician. There's also spaces for Black-Irish collaboration. Obviously, there's a lot of issues with white supremacy and distrust between white workers and Black workers, but there's also instances like related by Pops Foster of being hired to work on the docks by an Irish union leader because he played the bass, and because Mr. O'Sullivan wanted to learn how to play the bass. And there were these lawn parties where Black musician workers would play for Irish workers and audiences. So it wasn't perfect. I'm not trying to romanticize the situation. There was a lot of interracial tension, and like I mentioned, a lot of anti-Black violence. But the music is interesting. It did seem to at times bring these communities together and actually created the conditions for solidarity. So I just think, one of the things I try to argue is that we can't understand early jazz without this labor history, but we also can't understand the labor history without attending to this musical aspect of it.
And just before we come to the end of this conversation, given that there are lots of protests around the world for Palestine, political protests for against demagogues in other countries about protests when workers were on strike, in your observation, how do you see that tradition being continued? I mean, the role of music in political struggle?
Absolutely, Morteza. I mean, if you look at one of the really interesting groups that I've studied in recent years, or and been in, have worked to support as a college organizer, was a Palestinian hip hop group called
Mhm.
Dom. And the Palestinian hip hop movement in general is really interesting. It's different artists and MCs have worked to unite the West Bank and Gaza, which of course they have not been able to, for even before, way before this recent genocide that's ongoing right now. They were, folks in West Bank and Gaza and 48 Palestine and within Israel have been unable to have freedom of movement and communicate with each other. But hip hop culture was one interesting space where Palestinians could create a kind of like community, especially a youth oriented community outside of these geographic and sectional divisions that were intentionally set up. And there's a lot of actually women MCs in this movement too that challenges the sort of Islamophobic narratives about Palestine and Arab society more broadly. Not to say that there aren't patriarchal tendencies, but there are patriarchal tendencies everywhere. It's a world historic problem, not exclusive to one particular region. Anyway, just to get back to your point here, I think hip hop has become a global vehicle for oppressed and marginalized and subaltern peoples in almost any context you could imagine. And that's exactly the role that brass bands and Afrological and African American music traditions were playing in this time period, right? And that jazz becomes, in the 1920s and 30s, a form of oppositional expression, certainly tied to American capitalism and consumer culture, sure. But when jazz is exported to places, usually by U.S. Marines, and at least in the case of the Caribbean and Central America during military occupations, that music is almost always appropriated by African and Afro-descendant and oppressed communities in those countries and spaces and turned into a music of resistance. Um, so yes, I think there's sequels to Brassroots Democracy. I still think we're living in this in the long durée of Brassroots Democracy in the sense that we still live in the specter of plantation power and American imperialism and American capitalism, and we also live in the combined agency of the resistance to those movements, which I think have been in many ways led historically, or at least have had very prominent representation from peoples of African descent in the Americas. And so I think that it makes sense that this music has become a kind of a beacon of freedom, a sort of counter public sphere where new ideas and new negotiations of identity can take place in a space where solidarity and trust are forged through sound and rhythm and movement and lyric and melody and harmony. And I think that who knows what the next version of this is going to be? Who knows what the next vision or articulation of grassroots democracy will be? But surely it will respond to the new machinations and operations of power and oppression, and surely it will be mind-blowingly inventive and creative and soulful in ways that we can't even comprehend right now. So I hope that kind of answers that question. It is always hard to speak about the present because we are living it right now and it's unwritten.
Absolutely, yeah. You're right. Um, Ben, thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk with us about your book. I just need to reiterate it to our listeners. It's a fascinating book. You do learn a lot about the history of music, about a lot of musicians you've never heard of before, maybe, and then, like me, you get interested to check out their music and listen to them, but also how they fought for democracy and the role of, and in a way, I guess to me, it's the history of the role of music in bringing people together and fighting for justice. So the book we just discussed was called Brassroots Democracy, Maroon, Ecologies, and the Jazz Commons, written by Benjamin Barson, published by Wesley University Press this year. Ben, thank you very much for the time to speak with us on New Books Network.
Morteza, it's always one of my favorite places to come is on the New Books Network. I just specifically getting a chance to dialogue with you, who is so knowledgeable and so principled and so committed to justice and liberation for oppressed people. And I just can't thank you enough for having me back. And I look forward to being in touch with you about new work in the future.
Hopefully, I'll speak with you soon again when your new book comes out. Thank you.
Take care.